Happy Friday. It is November 22nd. The year is slipping away from us, but I'm happy to be in this room talking about so many exciting things. Maura Carabello is here from the Exoro group, and Representative Wilcox here, taking a break from the legislative session and exciting travels. Good to have you both with us.
Yeah, good to be here.
Always good. Always a good time here.
So, Maura, I feel like it's been a couple weeks since we've been together.
Been.
Have you been doing fun things or working like crazy?
I went to Mexico. That
Ooh
was
la
good.
la.
Yeah, we did. It was perfect. Chris was officiating a wedding. I had no reason to be there. Someone else had made all the choices.
Oh, that's all the reason.
It was great.
Awesome. So this is why you're looking a little glowy right now. You got some sunshine?
Yeah, I did get some sunshine.
Nice.
So,
all right.
I want to hear how Chris's Spanish is doing.
Is he fluent?
No, I mean, no. This was an American.
Oh.
Yeah, I don't know. That would have been
like
impressive.
a vacation
like,
wedding.
oh yeah, it was a vacation wedding. I should have
wedding.
clarified. Yeah, I'm like, he only knows.
I didn't know this.
He only knows pop Spanish.
That's different.
It's enough to get you in trouble to get by. Well, that's fun.
Let's go.
That's exactly.
And you haven't been vacationing, or you have in between all the hard
work. I did
work.
perform a wedding once, but I haven't been asked to do the second one yet. I'm kind of.
So once you can legally do a wedding, do you have to keep getting your license, or once you're gifted in that?
I can't remember the esteemed organization that gave him his license, but I do know it took him about 15 minutes online and was like $35. It's like the national. It's the same one that who's that HBO guy? It's like the Universal Church
Bill
of
Maura?
Tomorrow or something.
And then you can do it.
Yeah, but it is legal.
I love that.
But no, it's.
It's legal even in Mexico.
Even in Mexico.
I don't know if mine is. I can only perform weddings because I'm a legislator.
That's right.
Oh, so you can already do that. That's good to know if I ever need like an emergency
wedding. I can totally do it.
If you need backup, you can always go to this place. And I think if I remember right, if you pay more, they also give you a laminated card. Just in case you need like
go swimming with it.
Your officiant's card here and there.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Super powerful.
All right, this is why we come together and brainstorm important things. And you said you just got back from Washington D.C. What were you doing there? Taking people on tours or doing actual business and work?
No, just work. That's my job.
Just work.
Federal healthcare policy. So I was in and out of a lot of offices last week. Of course, as they were just coming back from the election. They've been there for the last 2 weeks, right?
Yeah.
This is the first part of what we call the lame duck. And it was kind of like that. Not a lot of intelligent policy was made.
Just some good old-fashioned political gossip.
Good old-fashioned political gossip.
So what did you see in the halls or like at somebody's office that you're dying to tell us? There's always crazy stories. So I have a brother who works intelligence, and before that he worked starting out. It's one of the best ways to start out in law enforcement, being a Capitol officer. And sometimes the stories he came home with and told me about, I was like, what?
Yeah. A lot of, it was funny. Okay, it was funny. And this is not a comment on any of the people that were nominated, but I was there during the nominations as they were all released. And
so Trump's cabinet nominations.
Trump's cabinet nominations. So I was there, in Colorado and Nevada delegation offices when they announced the Attorney General pick.
And were they loving it or hating it?
It was not an excited moment in those offices, and even the Republican ones. It was holy cats, this is happening.
Holy cats.
He was fast and furious, too.
He was dumping them out.
I know.
RFK Jr. hit Thursday night.
Right.
I was going to save him for later, but do we want to talk about the cabinet picks real quick off the top? Let's do it. So
we've already run through one of them.
Yeah, so Gates obviously was one of the first ones out of the literal gate, and people were like, oh, wow. And interesting watching the reaction on social media. A lot of people are like, oh, he's just the tiger we need in there. He dropped out fairly quickly after meeting with senators, we assume because he didn't have the support. A list came out of 4 senators that he didn't have backing from, including John Curtis. John Curtis set out a statement that basically said, I'm looking at everyone holistically, I'll vote on them accordingly, but didn't really give us an answer.
Yeah, it also might be related that today the House announced that they weren't going to release the report to the public. I mean, I think Gates
someone's
was not
going to leak it still, though, right?
Popular among people. So the political rumors, Ryan may have heard these too. The political rumors I heard is that this was the start of Susie Wiles. Is that her?
Yeah.
The
new chief of staff.
Chief of staff to the Trump administration. That this was her playing like 4-dimensional chess already, and this was her way of getting Matt Gaetz out. So I don't. It sounds too complicated. So I love it. I love the idea that that's what she.
Do you think that they're actually thinking 4-dimensional chess, or was this just
this was
a loose
attributed
maker?
specifically to this person. I will
Interesting.
say. I'm not saying that is the methodology that is being used in all of
And
this.
Susie Wiles was the first pick that came out, and I liked that she was the first pick because she was a she and will make history in that office. She's, interestingly enough, worked for a ton of Republicans, but she worked on 2 presidential campaigns that Utahns paid attention to in 2012. First for John Huntsman when he was running, coming off his ambassadorship, and then switched over to Team Romney. So she's worked with them. Either of you have worked with her or only know her from the political circles?
No, she has a great reputation.
Yeah.
And the other thing we've learned about Trump is that it apparently pays to be from Florida. It feels like every third choice is a Floridian.
A lot of those.
Yeah, and the interesting thing is I know a lot of them because they were in different
when you were
positions
there?
when I was working there, so it's kind of fun. Marco Rubio used to hang out with me. I think I've told this story on the podcast before, but he was in the legislature then, and I believe he was the House Speaker. And so he would come into our morning show. It was 5 hours, and so he'd come in at some point when he was on his way up north to head to the legislative session, stop in, do interviews, chat, hang out. And so I felt like we were kind of, buddies, and he was a fun person to talk
I
to.
feel like you should reconnect.
Yeah, super interesting. And have you ever talked to someone where sometimes you just want them to disengage? He's very intense when he listens to you, like the eye contact, and it's like sometimes so intense, like they're looking at your soul, where you're just like, I gotta look away for a second. He's one of those people where he's like a really great listener, whether you like his politics or not, he listens.
I've never heard that description in talking to Marco, but I agree 100%. Right, he is very intentionally there with you, which is kind of opposite so many people in politics, and so I kind of appreciate that. But yeah, I could totally see how you describe that.
Yeah, I have a fun picture after I moved back to Utah, and it was when Romney was running for president in 2012, and I was covering the debate in Denver. And if you've ever been in the spin rooms afterwards, it's just insanity, and reporters from all around the world, and everyone's screaming, and there was a bunch of men there and just like yelling and trying to get people's attention. And Marco Rubio came into the spin room first. And just because I hadn't been gone from Florida that long, I think he probably zeroed in on me just because we knew each other.
Nice, yeah.
I got all the questions, and everybody was
Nice.
looking dirty looks at me. I loved it.
That was
Yeah.
good. That's
But
good.
if you were to say Heidi Hatch to him now, he'd probably be like, where do I remember her from? He won't remember.
Well,
But
let's see.
yeah.
I think we should test it.
So we'll test it at some point. We'll figure out and see if
I'm
we're
sure
still
he'll
friends.
visit Utah soon.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm trying to think who else is interesting on the list. Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard. Any thoughts on that one?
She's kind of she's a great communicator. She's thin a little on area expertise, as are a few. Not everybody, though. I mean, I should say there's some depth that I didn't expect in some areas.
Who's
or
the depth
some
you're thinking?
Experience. Oh gosh, I'll have to.
There was
remember.
Elise Stefanik for Ambassador of the United Nations.
Yeah, and she is really persuasive. I'm not sure. I mean, this is clearly 2 and 3 pay grade jumps for her, but she is a persuasive woman. I mean, she made some of the best cases for support I think that we saw the Trump campaign make, and she holds her cool and she creates her own. FBI and intelligence, they've had some experience. I think he still has some character issues with a couple of them, but I don't know that is going to be necessarily ever anything that Trump is going to screen for. Tulsi Gabbard, I think, may end up being too much of a wild card. RFK is just going to be interesting because I think he's going to beat to his own drum. I don't know that they're always going to, that the administration is always going to have control over him. The question is, will the administration care? And I'm not sure that they will care if they always have control over him.
That's a good assessment there. I want to go back to Tulsi a little bit. She's really fun for me.
And why is that?
In that particular role. But that's where she's been attacked from, right? And frankly, unjustly, a lot. There's not a single piece of evidence that's come out that's, she's a Russian asset.
I think she got thrown under that Russia bus when everyone was
it started with
Russian-gating.
Hillary Clinton, right? It was a political move at the time to pull her out from that race, and it kind of just got jumped on by the rest of the media over and over. When you look at it, and she said, was she a lieutenant colonel in the National Guard still? She's been an independent thinker across the board. She's not afraid to criticize whoever it is. I love that in that role. She's a good communicator, like you said. I love that she's a former Democrat. She ran against President Trump for president.
Yeah,
She
which
was
is
trying-
intriguing.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me.
I would have liked to have seen her in a domestic role, though. I feel like the intelligence positions are well served with a little area expertise, of which she doesn't have any.
So she's going to have to find other people who support her. I'm trying to think. One thing that kind of surprised me was Secretary of Homeland Security. I didn't see this one coming, Kristi Noem.
You know what? I'm always a fan of governors. I'll just say that. So, I don't know that she comes in, but governors always have a breadth. And she's been a governor for a minute, right?
They have to deal with a lot.
Second term. She's, I don't know. So many of these are unproven, unexpected. So we'll see. But I did like that she was a governor.
The one I'm really excited about to see what he does is RFK Jr. And I know that he's a lightning rod, and a lot of people take sound bites from him, and he sounds crazy. But I have listened to him for a lot of years.
Yeah.
I actually started researching. I started listening to him a long time ago because before I even had kids, I just started reading books about, when normal people are reading parenting books, I was reading about vaccines and health and whatnot. And so I've listened to some really long format discussions he's had. And I think when you listen to him and listen to him for an hour or two, as opposed to just a soundbite, I think you get a lot more depth and understanding of where he's coming from. He was an environmental lawyer that had worked for a long time in getting mercury out of rivers and cleaning up the
And sued
environment.
President Trump.
Yeah. Which is interesting, and the way that he got into a lot of the health issues, which I don't think he'd previously been into, because if you look at his past, I think he was like a Kennedy doing drugs and doing who knows what. But there were moms who saw the work he was doing with getting mercury out of water and had been concerned about their own kids' health, and had eventually just shown up at his meetings and shown up and started being like, please, we think we may have some similar problems that may be related to vaccines. And he started taking deep dives into health and the way the government runs, and how there's a revolving door with people in and out of the health systems, and then into the pharmaceuticals back and forth. So I think shaking things up is good, but I think that some people are overly optimistic what some of these people can do. They're like, we're going to change the world. And I'm like, are you? Or are you going to shift the needle slightly? So
Yeah,
it'll be
it's
interesting.
a big old barge to turn around.
Yeah.
Whoever's driving it, it's a big old barge. My claim to fame is I did spend 2 days hiking.
I know you, and I
Really
forget
good.
that was like 20 years ago, 30
Yeah.
years ago. How
Brought
long
him
ago?
in here. I brought him in here to speak when he was doing a bunch of the mercury work. And he was supposed to go to the airport and didn't seem, I was responsible for taking him to the airport, of which he had no interest. He was like, yeah, it'll be fine. And I'm like, it's really not. It's time, it's space, it's not going to be fine. He wanted to stop at Maddox for a steak on the way to the airport.
Oh, nice.
Geez, that just makes me like it.
It was, yeah, there you go. There
He
you go.
wasn't into super fitness guy at the time, though, right? That was probably before
No,
then.
he's really evolved and gone deeper in some areas. So that was before all of that,
All
before
right.
the worm.
Before the worm, parasites. If only we all knew if we had parasites inside of us. I've been reading a lot about that, and I'm like, we're one of the only countries in the world that doesn't do parasite cleanses on a regular basis. And I'm like, shoot, do we all need to be getting rid of worms ourselves? I don't know.
Well,
So,
one thing I'm worried about with, not to say I'm worried about, but I think the reason why that resonated so much is because he talked about things that we all see. Half of our kids are obese. That necessarily comes from somewhere, right? And what does that look like? I kind of love the angle, and this goes back to the Mehmet Oz appointment at CMS as well.
yeah.
Right, and the part of that I like a lot is the attention that they're giving to proactive care. What we talk about in the industry is proactive care, getting ahead of these diseases. The charge he's been given at RFK in this particular sense is to get ahead of the chronic disease epidemic. We really do have that. That's really a major issue.
Yeah.
for
What you
all
put
of
in
us.
your body matters.
What you put in your body matters. So to the extent that they're able to turn that ship that direction and accelerate those efforts, I think 100% that's a good thing for us.
Yeah, I was reading about how much money we could save as a country if we just got back to some of the basics of just the exercise and eating right, and some of the things that before our world changed so much, where if you got back to that, how much money our country could save
So the
on
test will
healthcare.
be, the criticism I would have, and the test will be, is that I feel like Trump has an inclination in many areas to pick personalities,
Yeah.
people who have high profiles, not a lot of depth in their issue, but they're great spokespeople. So then the real test is, who do they surround themselves with, right?
And that's the important
Who does,
part.
because they don't necessarily, we've become so big. The reality is that the president is more representational than they are workaday, right? Like at their best.
Yeah.
And in many ways, the cabinet is as well. So the test is, will they get some serious-minded? I am not going to throw every bureaucrat under the bus and say that there aren't really hardworking public servants there. How do you lean it out, throw it out if you need to, but keep the expertise that is in place? How do you make change but not destroy things, right?
Yeah.
I think that, and that'll be the test, because I think, has a propensity to go for personality, which is who he is, right? He's not a policy guy, he's a personality guy. And I feel like many of his choices, the commerce stuff doesn't scare me as much as it would. The couple of guys are on the Federal Reserve. I think those are interesting picks that are surprisingly substantive. I think that the education of secretary is just, you just gotta have to watch that, right? Who even knows what's going to happen
WrestleMania.
with that department? CIA has some experience there, some depth. Then he's just got some rich people, so I think it's gonna be interesting.
Well,
The one thing
that
that-
department, they made the same commitment that President Reagan did, and that is he was going to eliminate it.
Yeah,
That didn't happen.
he made that commitment the first time too,
Yeah.
and part of it is, things are easy to say.
Yeah.
And then so many interests. I mean, there are so many interests.
Yeah, dismantling things is hard, and I think
For
that if you
sure.
were to talk to local school districts and boards, I think they would like to have more control back, but how you get rid of that layer above it, and I don't know, so we'll have to watch that carefully.
Yeah.
One thing that I've been watching is, I think there's been a lot of talk about Senator Mike Lee and how much time he spent with President Trump, and would he end up in a cabinet. I've been kind of watching this closely, and the more I thought about it, I'm like, he's not going to want a 4-year appointment to anything while he's president, because then you lose the opportunity to keep running as a senator, you lose your seat. So the only thing I see in my mind at this point is, if for some reason in the 4-year term there were to be a Supreme Court justice opening, that he would take that. But I just don't see him wanting to lose his place in the Senate and then not get it back again. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong.
Yeah, I think that's always been a rumor for Utah more
Yeah.
than it was a reality strategically for anybody. The other thing that I think is going to come into play is, I think Trump, I'm going to use the term lame duck, I think Trump has about 18 months. And then the challenge that he has, and maybe he'll rise to be an exception to the rule, is that after that, you
got the
with
interim election, yeah.
absolutely, he's not going to stand for re-election. And we know he doesn't have many tails. He has not traditionally had long coattails. And what we can reliably trust with politicians is they're starting to look to what serves them for the future, not today. So the Lindsey Grahams of the world are not going to assess that Trump has much for him after 18 or 25 months unless he's packaged some either big carrot or big stick that is something we don't
Interesting.
usually see, because he will not be up for re-election. Within 18 months, you're going to start identifying Republicans who want to be the next president. They're going to have to start putting themselves in position during midterms. The politicking is going to start within the Republican Party, because we do know that Donald Trump's not going to stand for election in 2028.
Do we think that there's a possibility that we'll see J.D. Vance elevated by the president, or is he too big of a personality to maybe give the stage to him on the second half to elevate him for a possible run?
I think this is going to look different than anything we had in the past this time. One of the themes that I've heard over and over again is that he didn't really know what he was getting into the first time, and therefore kind of got overwhelmed by DC and the bureaucracy that was already built into it. And he's not going to make those mistakes now. And I think that's probably reflected in this propensity to hire loyalists, right?
Right.
Over any other factor that you hinted at a minute ago. But I would expect there to be, because JD's has been one of those. He's certainly filled that role well so far. I think there's a good high likelihood that there's multiple of these people that we talked about that are also running for president in the next cycle.
Yeah.
And
What's interesting about,
Right?
about Vance and Trump's relationship is,
Yeah.
I think they have a natural affinity, but also like Trump sort of purged him a couple times during the, ignored him, put him in timeout a little bit in the media cycle.
Yeah.
Got a little annoyed with him a couple of times and was like, yeah, whatever, don't listen to that guy. But it was sort of okay. It wasn't where normally if someone had done that to the vice president, we would be like, what? And it just felt sort of Trumpy. I mean, it felt like, oh, and then J.D. Vance was back again. And so I think they're going to have an
interesting
weird,
relationship.
unique public relationship. Who knows with their private one? They seem to have a genuine affinity, but you've got to figure the guy that he's young, he's upwardly mobile, he's articulate, like, why is he not going to be aggressive about his position next?
I don't think. I would expect that to be a stronger position within the White House than it was the last cycle for sure with Pence.
The other thing from the left of center side is once you saw that the Republicans were going to win on election night, you wanted them to have all three bodies, right? Because everything's now their fault. And in the way
blame
that
game,
happens, right? In that superficial of politics. And the other factor when you have all three bodies and everything's your fault, pretty soon you're going to start to need to differentiate between the executive branch and the legislative branch again. And the Senate and the House can kind of work together in that, but you're going to, I think, naturally see some differentiating between how much control they will and can give the executive branch, which has been a thorn in the side for cycles. It's just we switch back and forth whether we want a Republican executive or a Democratic executive, but pretty much executive power is to be questioned and checked by both parties right now a little bit, and I think you'll see the legislative body start to do that.
We need a massive overhaul when we're talking about checking the power. Like the executive branch is so far out of whack with where we started with, Article 1, Section 8. Like, this is not even reflective of what we have in the Constitution anymore.
And I think Trump is going to really lean into executive power. I think he is an executive, he is an individual leader, and so that'll be interesting to see how that starts to play out.
How do the two branches, how does the House and the Senate push back, not because they disagree with him on policy, but because they should have been the ones making the decision in the first place.
That's exactly
right. One thing that I actually have liked is they've been back there working out getting their speaker and the Senate leader lined up. Is Senator Mike Lee, the night before they had their election, got the three who were there and had discussions, and I think worked back to what the Senate should have been doing and got agreements that they would actually debate bills, they could have amendments, because Mitch McConnell, who's been in power for close to 20 years, was it 2007, really got rid of it where he was behind closed doors making the deals and he was kind of the kingmaker, and then you could vote yes or no, but the senators didn't really get to be that deliberative body that we like to think the Senate is. So I'll be excited to see if they go back to debating and actually getting amendments and having conversations where senators feel like they can do something other than just show up and say yes or no.
That's where our senior senator is at his best. When he's talking process, when he's ensuring that, because this improves the body long term for everyone. Like this thing that we created under Harry Reid and then Mitch McConnell back and forth really is terrible for the country. You end up with 3 and 4 people making the decisions for the 535. That's not what any of us elected.
I also think you're going to see our junior senator in Senator Curtis really push for process, integrity, long-term thinking. Those are themes he has had for years. He just brought on Boyd Matheson as a senior advisor. Those are things that Boyd Matheson believes in. Boyd, as we remember, was chief of staff to Lee. So I think our 2 senators are in a position, whether they'll continue to take advantage of it. Lee sort of goes in and out of his statesman role. I hope he stays in that statesman role. Curtis, I think, stays in it. We could have, because of the confidence that Republicans have here of the reelect, you have some ability to use your bully pulpit because you know your reelect is okay.
So now we get to watch and see how it all shakes out. So now instead of counting down to Christmas, I see little people, tearing off their rings till we get to swearing in day to see exactly what happens and what can actually be accomplished. So we'll see how that goes. I want to talk a little bit about our Utah election wrap up. We've been watching. I've seen a lot more frustration this election than I have in past about how long it's been taking to count the votes, which is weird to me because we've actually had some big congressional seats that have been held up when they're voting or in gubernatorial primaries where we're waiting for weeks to figure out who really is going to win it. We haven't had any huge seats or issues that seem to be hanging in the balance. But there seems to be a lot of frustration online of people being like, why are we doing this? This means that, something has to be going wrong, which doesn't mean it has to be going wrong, but I do feel like there have got to be ways that we can count quicker than we do. I'm like, is there no overtime in government? Can you just not take extra days off? Like, work a long weekend? But I feel like there's got to be ways where we can speed up the process of counting votes because 100%. It seems like it takes forever. Is there anything that you guys can think of that would make it, or do the county clerks just need to get to it and figure out some ways?
Part of right now is the intense scrutiny they've been in the last couple cycles. And I think there's a hesitation. I think part of the slowing down has just been the snarkiness of people watching the process. I also totally agree with you, but I would point out that announcing victory numbers are just to feed the information stream. The canvas is, you know, November 25th was our canvas date. Everyone meets the canvas date. I am a junkie who wants it immediately, and I'm frustrated that you can't give it to me. So I agree with it, but we also have to remember there is no legal need to see it 2 days later. There is an emotional need. Certainly there's a really important need for those who have been running to just know and resolve their issues. So it matters, but I also want to remember it's not like anything happens to us if we have to wait 2 extra days for the results.
Yeah, that's all true, and yeah, there are things we can do.
Yeah.
I can answer your question. We've had a crew working on this stuff in the House for quite a while. You know, different senators have been helping. There are some states that did a better job, and we've been studying why. What did they do differently on a process side? And it doesn't mean our county clerks did anything wrong. It just means we had a different process. And like, why were you guys able to do this so much quicker? Well, part of that, one of those easy things, is that all the ballots that come in early, the mail-in ballots, we're going to allow them to count them earlier. We won't announce anything, but we're going to tabulate those things ahead of time so that all of those that are done, they're already ready to go. We announce them that night. We don't have to wait for anything else instead of waiting to get that done. That's a super simple, easy switch that will be one of those bills that we run that will help with that scenario. And then there'll be a number of other changes too that I think will, we learn as we go when we're working on these.
I will say the gold standard in Utah, who always has election night, is Sully County.
Yeah.
Sully County has always been really quick about their vote counts. And we have in the last couple of years upped our education and investment in the clerk systems in smaller counties who maybe have not had the budget, frankly, to do it, and the budget to hire people. It's not that they were negligent at all, but they just haven't had the resources.
So how does the process work? Because I knew that when they got in there, they matched the signatures up. I thought they ran them through the machine but didn't hit some button to tabulate them. So they can't even run them right now through the machines at this point. Once they've been checked, they have to keep the stacks set aside till actual election day, or how does that work?
I don't want to I'm not an elections expert on the process itself, exactly when they do which part. What I'm telling you is as we've studied these other states that were able to do it much quicker, that was one of the first things that came back. Is that, hey, we maybe don't need to wait for that.
They can run prior. They just can't tabulate.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, that makes sense. A couple of elections that caught my eye, they were super close, and I was watching them over the last couple of weeks, but a couple legislative seats flipped. Yeah. Rosemary Lesser lost a seat, flips Republican. Jill Coford. Winning, and these are really close races when you look at it. It's like 309 votes apart for that one. That's your district?
Not my district, my county.
Your county, okay.
Yeah, I serve in the north end of the county, this is the south end of the county. I know both of them very well. Dr. Lesser is wonderful. She's, OBGYN in our community for a long time, delivered a lot of babies in that district. And Jill is in education. She's also well known. She's served her community in all sorts of ways down there. So this is the second time they've run in that. That's the other interesting thing, right? So you had the off-cycle election, and then you had the presidential. Rosemary was a midterm replacement, kind of, 4 years ago when Lou Shirtliff passed away. So Lou won the race in December, and then won the race in November, passed away in December, and Rosemary, so even though she served that entire term, hadn't been through an election cycle. So the only time that Rosemary had ever run a race is now against Jill Coford. And it was like a 200 vote split last time where Rosemary won, and this time Jill pulled it off. So it's a fascinating one to watch in that community. Everybody knows both of them.
Yeah,
it wasn't like
both run a couple.
And now it's the second cycle with both of them.
Yeah.
So it's like neighbors, and it very much lined up. I think there's no question that in a Republican cycle, when you have a strong
trickle down.
I think that brought out more Republicans for sure. This time, which probably helped Jill, but then it's also these other factors that they've now run twice. Jill had never run for anything last cycle, and Rosemary had the advantage of being the legislator for 2 years from the area.
I also think it's important to note how much money the House put into the Coford race. And I mean,
I thought you were going to say how much the Dems put into the Lesser race.
I mean, that is sort of, so we'll take both parties took a particular interest in this. Yeah. I think it's hard for representatives when their colleagues rightly so, because it's a party issue at that point.
Yeah.
But rightly so, I know in talking to Representative Lesser, she's feeling it because to some degree her colleagues organized against her for partisan reasons, I don't think at a
Not because they don't
personal
like her, yeah.
Yeah, and there was a ton of money in this local race, which is trickier because a lot of times local politics doesn't love money. I mean, I know the adage is you always just throw it at it. That's not true when it comes to neighbors. They sort of get resistant to you appearing to buy something from them. And so I think that makes it interesting. This seat has gone back and forth since 18. Huge shout out, and I hope this never changes. But I have always relied on Weber and Davis County to be normal people, in which partisanship wasn't, I feel like they read more. I don't know what they're doing.
Having good conversations.
But I feel like they pay more attention to issue. I think they pay more attention to individuals. They're not so driven by headlines, has always been my perception, which is one of the reasons why I think you often see close races or back and forth races or interesting, even in the redistricting conversations.
Yeah.
I think Weber Davis, for me, have always been really interesting.
All right, high five to them. And then Judy Weeks-Roner, a Republican, chose not to run. Her seat flipped to Democrats with Jake Fitzimanu. Is that how you say his name? That one was a close race, not as close. They were probably a bigger 600 or 700 point swing apart, but that one flipped. So I like to see these races where there's a little competition going on here in Utah, like you said, and conversations and meeting people, because it means people are getting involved and talking about it and meeting them.
History making to Pacific Islanders. There was an Idahoan who was the first male ever elected in America.
Oh, wow.
Our representative is number 2, but the woman who got elected is the first Pacific Islander female to ever be elected in a state legislature.
Wow.
Yeah, so we have 2 Pacific Islanders now.
Awesome. Which makes sense because in Utah, I feel like when I was growing up, there wasn't as much diversity, and that was the diversity that we knew were the Pacific Islander population. And so I feel like it's about time then. I hadn't realized that hadn't happened.
I want to mention something about House 30 that I think is interesting for everybody to realize. So Fred Cox has served twice, right, in the swing district in that area. I served with him like 15 years ago, and then I left, and he came back again, and then he was gone again. Anyway, so we watched that go back and forth. It was a very known quantity in that district. And Jake serves on the city council out in West Valley and has been particularly competent.
Yeah.
He's a great guy out there.
He's very practical.
And so it's similarly well known at this point in the community, very practical. He does a lot of work with the Pacific Islander community nationally. I don't know if everybody knows that, but I run into him in the airport while he's doing that.
He's doing that, interesting.
Right, he's a real smart guy out there too. And I think not just watching because it's a close race, but like I talked about with Rosemary and Jill, that old quote, all politics is local. It really is when it comes down to these close ones, right? And people know all these people involved and what they've done in the community and what they're likely to do when they get up on the hill. And that's fun.
It was interesting that money was getting spent in some of those local races, because usually when we get to a presidential year, there's a lot of money getting spent on the airwaves, even here in Utah where we're just not as competitive. This year, though, there was no money spent here. There was really not a race that was competitive at all. And so sometimes you'd have outside money coming in from DC or a super PAC, nothing. So it gave you a mental break in the commercials.
US Senate primary took care of a lot of outside money.
Yeah.
There was some investing going on.
There was some money there.
But general election, no, there was very little.
The money dried up. And so I guess it saved your brain cells from listening to all that for a month or two.
You want more commercials, right? Until you go to a state, and then you're like,
make it
yourself
end.
in Philadelphia during the cycle.
And you're like, wow. So much information flowing in. A couple other things that were interesting. I think it was the Canyons District. I didn't write it down, but I shouldn't call him a kid. A young man who just graduated from high school, made it onto the school board there. I think he's 19 years old, which was interesting to see. And then on the Wasatch School Board, suddenly the winning candidate has been disqualified 9 days after the election, Tom Stone. He's now suing over this, but apparently he forgot to sign a financial disclosure, but it wasn't flagged until the election was actually over with and they were counting votes. So you think that he has a right here to the election and shouldn't get kicked out then?
Well, 100%. If he's going to be disqualified, that happened, well ahead, you said 9 days?
Exactly.
9 days ahead of the election cycle. They would have known that. If they had disqualified him then, they probably are on firm ground. because then they can communicate to everyone, a little bit like the
You may not want to
and
waste your vote on it.
whatever. Yeah, this isn't a thing. We're not going to tabulate it. But to run through the entire election cycle and then do it after it's completed, when the entire community believed that's what they were voting on, that can't stand.
I got annoyed with this. So I looked up that statute because I filed a lot of disclosures, and I was like, okay, what's the deal? So on one hand, rules are rules, deadlines are deadlines. Except I agree with Ryan, if the state's not gonna follow their deadlines, how are you criticizing a candidate for not? And the state deadline I don't feel like was filed is that it says in statute that if a candidate hasn't remedied his deadline or her deadline in 24 hours, the state will then mandatorily disqualify, and that includes you have to post on a website that the voters, so no, blah, blah, blah. It goes on for 2 or 3 cycles. It's the same with, it mirrors the legislative rules. Because I wasn't sure if school board had anything different.
Yeah.
It pretty much mirrors legislative. But in that instance, the onus is therefore on the lieutenant governor's office who triggers this. If they're going to enforce a 24-hour deadline, then you must enforce it within, they should have notified him a day after he missed that deadline, and he did miss the deadline. They
Which
should
he
have
admits to,
notified
yeah.
him a day later and disqualified them. The important part of that is then, and that requirement deadline was before the election. At that point, they would have told the voters that this candidate would have been disqualified, and he would have just had to have lived with what he said is, I had some family stuff going on and I missed this deadline. And you're sympathetic to him because he also goes on to say, I didn't even spend any money in that cycle. But for me, I'm like, at that point, had the LG and the clerk been on top of it, I'd be like, bummer, dude, rules are rules. But because they also did not meet their statutory obligation, I'm like, wait a minute, the hypocrisy here is, and you've got a group of voters, the clerk's office posted the disqualification after the election. Give me a break.
You can't do that.
That's,
Yeah, when
that
they were
just
actually
shows
counting
that
votes.
you also were asleep at the wheel. You're gonna disqualify a perfectly, like, you're going to overturn the will of the people because you also didn't have a tight rein on the criticism that you're lodging at him. I hope he wins.
Speaking of the
I don't
will of
know
the
him.
people.
I don't either. I have no
I don't know him at all.
I'm like, I got no idea if he's,
Yeah.
I don't know
I've
anything.
never
Yeah. I know, there's always the spirit and the letter of the law, and the will of the people, as we saw in the gubernatorial race with the Governor Cox gets another term. Phil Lyman persists. He is a persistent young man. He'll appreciate that I called him young, right?
Oh, that's nice.
So he's celebrating that they got 200,000 write-in votes, which is an accomplishment.
It is something to
amazing.
celebrate.
For
That's
sure.
awesome.
Yeah, which is in a statewide race, a lot of people to get behind you and signing in, but 200,000 is still not close to winning that race. He has several lawsuits going. He's still telling the people who supported him online, this fight's not over with. I don't know if he's just saying these words or actually believes that these lawsuits will go through and he will be the governor someday, but when you read what he writes, it sounds to me like his intention is that he will still have the governor's mansion, which would overturn the will of the people and the election that happened.
Yeah, he's trying to make a little cottage industry out of making, I think, money and getting himself attention. I sort of have no more room for him. I appreciate the service he gave when he was an elected official. I appreciate anybody who will run, and enough already. This just feels like antics and attention seeking in a world where I'm so tired of attention seeking.
Yeah, this is what I'm hearing from people who talk to him too, that he at this point is keeping like the steam and the gas going because he wants to run something to help other people with elections.
Let's harken back to the Merrill Cook days. Like, I feel like he is going to make a living out of being a disgruntled candidate, a Don Quixote of what, I'm not sure. But I think this is going to just
This is
be
his
what he
new
does.
thing.
Oh, this is the pause where I'm supposed to say something.
Yeah,
No,
you
I
had
know.
something
You're
to
like,
say.
I'm good.
I'm trying to think how do I respond to that.
He's got, even if his intent isn't to become the governor someday and he thinks the courts are going to overturn it, he's got people who follow him online so convinced that that's going to happen, though. That's the piece that's somewhat concerning to me, that if he's doing this just to keep his name out there for a business he's going to be doing and consulting on things, he's dragging all these other people along with him that are convinced that they're still fighting for him.
The creation of the 501c4, when I saw that and saw the announcement, that was my first thought.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a little concerning. This is not about this election anymore. This is clearly an intent to do something else.
Yeah.
And so I think any of us that were studying that or watching that, we're thinking something similar. I'm looking at his statement right now. The obstruction is the tell, we will prevail, it's inevitable. I don't know that that's accurate. That's probably not true, right? Like, he hasn't won a single case. This isn't like the first one. Like,
right.
we've had several before the court, including the Supreme Court here in Utah. And regardless of what he believes the wrongs are that have taken place, ironically, he just came out of being a legislator.
Yeah.
And there are ways that we can change these things. We have several election bills. We are constantly working on that process. We did it last cycle. We'll do it again as we learn more each cycle about how to improve, so we'll adjust. That's the way to do that. That's the way to have those conversations. Like, there's something that we can do better, then let's do that, and we'll improve it through that legislative process. It very rarely does that happen through constantly suing the people in order to
It's the American way.
He voted for many of the laws that supposedly oppressed him this go around.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
Yeah.
And he's very anti-SB 54, and
Sure,
people are
he
riled
has
up at that,
assessment.
which is interesting because he actually filed as a signature gatherer. He didn't end up completing that, but he signed as an option too. So, moving on here, this is an issue that I thought was going to die down, but the transgender issues are back, I feel like, nationally and locally as well. It was part of how President Trump ran and possibly won in a couple swing states over transgender issues. Here in Utah, it's bubbling up again. USU just this week joined in a lawsuit that was filed by one of their co-captains of the women's volleyball team and 11 other women against the Mountain West Conference over a trans player on the San Jose State volleyball team. USU, SUU, and a half a dozen other teams ended up forfeiting matches during the season. They're heading now into a tournament in Las Vegas next week and hoping that a judge will rule in their favor where they will reinstate those games they lost to the forfeit or take this player out. We're waiting to see what happens. USU ended up joining after Speaker Schultz and President Adams and the governor encouraged them to back up their player and do this. Was this the right move, Maura?
The move is a request for a preliminary injunction.
Yeah.
Part of Utah State's assertion is they would be in a position, right?
Yeah.
And so the preliminary injunction is based on, I think, what will be a really high bar, because the Supreme Court has already ruled that the NCAA sports is not subject to Title IX in the same way. And that's what they'll have to prove for the injunction. It doesn't mean that there won't be a subsequent lawsuit. A lot of the language around the grievances are loss of privacy, loss of First Amendment, and then you get into concerns of fear. NCAA and Mountain West have continued to say that how they judge athletes, female athletes, are on testosterone levels, and they took this athlete and they were within the testosterone levels. So this won't get settled. I think for Republicans, it has been a cultural rallying cry that isn't going to go away soon. When you look at the percentages of athletes playing at a collegiate level, it's a different discussion, but that is less relevant because I think for Republicans, they found it to be a cultural rallying cry that's effective for them right now. But if you just look at the specific legal case, it's for a preliminary injunction, and it would require the court to rule against a pretty clear Supreme Court ruling. But that is to say, I think that's how this particular part of the story ends. I don't think that the San Jose, the Mountain West, Utah State issue and some of the grievances that the other athletes are bringing up is going away.
We've had a couple legislative sessions where I feel like transgender issues in the last decade have kind of sucked all the oxygen out of the room, where there have been other really important issues going on that didn't get the attention that I think they probably should have. Do you see it moving in that direction where in this upcoming legislative session here in Utah, we're going to see transgender bills again, or is this just a case that's going to be a case that's dealt with the universities and the eyes on the ball on other things during the legislative session?
We saw those in 2022 and then early 2023. It was the first Friday of the session, right?
Yeah.
We haven't really seen those since. I mean, it's ramping up nationally, but I haven't seen anything big. It hasn't been a big part of caucus discussions that I'm aware of with either caucus, with the minority or majority. That said, this is happening now. I presume you're referring to the Title IX lawsuit that was filed against the NCAA in March.
No, there was that, but this is settled law from a few years ago. So that was only sort of the notion of how far legally is this particular question going to go.
Gotcha.
And the reason they're urgent is they're trying to get, this would be
The
a
tournament.
request to stay in the tournament.
Yeah. I'm going to get to the legislative session in a second, but I wanted to mention back in Washington, Mike Lee is going to be heading the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Yeah, which is
awesome.
a big deal for him. Also
Yeah.
interesting, when you look at John Curtis, who's our new senator, he's very interested and has talked a lot about energy, so he's very focused on that. Yeah, so do you see good things coming from that?
I sure hope so. I mean, that was my job when I worked back there. I was the senior policy advisor on ENR. And man, it's that whole thing that we talk about with the feds owning 2/3 of Utah. That's not a joke. That's not like an exaggeration. We have to ask for Mother MAHA for just about anything we want to do across the state. So, and this is including access to SITLA, which is our state institutional trust lands that we fund education with. This is across the board for communities outside the Wasatch Front. It's a part of everyday life. So the fact that not only is he on that committee, it's a big deal that we're likely to have two members, both members of our delegation on that committee, and one of them is going to be the chair. While we have their party in power in the executive branch, that is a huge opportunity. So I hope we don't waste it. I hope we don't miss the opportunity that we have there for Utahns, because it's in a lot of ways, honestly, the federal government has more power than the governor does in 2/3 of Utah.
So I start from a fundamentally oppositional place to the grievance about we're always complaining about how much control they have. They have control over their land, so they should have control. And when we signed the statehood agreement, we agreed that it was their land. And so we're sort of whining about our parents being able to drive, and we as 13-year-olds can't drive. But I hear it, and it must be frustrating. But what I do agree with is that having a chair on a major committee, because whether we start in different places or end them, 2/3 of Utah is owned by the federal government.
Yep.
So their decisions really impact us, and the choices they make become lifestyle choices for us. And so having a seat at that table really matters. I hope they both get on it, because from my point of view, Senator Curtis has a broader perspective than Senator Lee does, so sometimes, and I am closer to the broader perspective. They both bring unique talents to this, which is cool. Like sometimes we would look and say, no guys, don't double down on one committee, but I do agree this committee is uniquely important to us, and they're both going to cover different sectors, and some will be the same, but I think it would be cool, and undeniably to have a chair of a committee that's as relevant to Utah is a really big stinking deal.
I get that question a lot about when it was Senator Romney and Senator Lee, about they're such different perspectives. Frankly, as a state legislator, of course I have my own personal opinions, whatever, but it's super helpful for us to go back there and advocate for them to have such a loud and strong voice in different parts of the caucus, right? Senator Lee is the elected leader of the Conservatives, the chairman of the steering committee, and Senator Romney had incredible influence with the moderates in the caucus. So if I needed to talk to them about whatever issue in Utah was happening,
you knew which parent to play.
Well, kinda, but that's we just use the two parent analogies here. It's important to recognize where we can make those arguments at the end of the day that benefit Utah and how we can leverage those relationships. So I don't think you're going to have as wide of a disparity between Curtis and Lee as we saw with Romney and Lee, particularly when you bring in somebody like Boyd Matheson to help guide that communication strategy. But I do think obviously they're different people and have different history and different perspectives, and I think they'll work together better.
All right, it'll be interesting to watch that. Our Utah legislative session, I think, is 60 days out, maybe 59 at this point.
Wow, we have a number.
I know, it's inching up on us. I feel like as soon as the holidays are done, we're going right into it, and we're already starting to hear things that are coming out of committees. We focused here on child abuse stories often here at KUTV, and it seems like there's a couple bills that we've been paying attention to that are going to be in there about putting some teeth into the law for people who make false child abuse reports. That would be for parents who are splitting up and just trying to play each other against for divorces, which really should be against the law. I mean, you shouldn't be able to accuse someone of that who hasn't done that. And then when we're talking about ritualistic child abuse, which is sad that that's even a thing, but it seems like with some recent cases that it might be something that needs more of a punishment here in the state of Utah. Do you see that being a real issue, or do we just have a couple cases that are drawing our attention that way?
What I would say is it passed out of committee unanimously, and it seems pretty straightforward and pretty narrow. The only thing you'd ever be concerned with is that there was an unintended drafting that let a bad person be worse. But people have really taken precautions to make sure that the drafting of these, as they were presented in interim, were good. So I always look and see how comfortable I am with the drafting process, and I think that this has been well hashed. Not because there was disagreement, because you just don't want to write and craft the wrong language in a policy like this.
So one of the beautiful things about the state side versus the federals, we can bounce back and forth with these, is, you know, one, the interim stuff means something, right? Like you do get more eyes on it on a slower timeline. So when something comes out of an interim committee in the fall, you can have, maybe not to say have more confidence, but you can, because you've been through several hearings and all of that process. But then also, if and when we get it wrong, and we get them wrong sometimes, we are aware of this. When we get those things wrong, you find out, you know, they get implemented in May, the governor maybe signs them in March, but by June, we usually have a good idea if we need to switch something, we need to change something, and we can the next cycle. On the federal side, it takes like a miracle.
And has to Congress, what are you working on? You have been working on some school security issues. Are we going to see that resurface again in this next session?
Yeah, that's a long-term project, unfortunately. I can't believe this is the stuff I have to work on as chair of law enforcement. I get to see all the things that people don't want to know exist in our state, and that's rough sometimes. And so we're working on, you know, organized crime subcommittee and different things there. But the school security thing in particular, we will have a follow-up. There are, you know, several aspects to that implementation that we'll learn as we go with that, and so that'll get easier, including authorization for, you know, school security, guardian options, or, you know, SROs, which is frankly what we want in most of those scenarios. What that looks like for your school security specialist, their training, making sure that in that worst case scenario, not only is that gap shortened between when the professionals are there and the threat is identified, but that we're able to get ahead of that on the prevention side. I talked about proactive care a little bit, referring to Dr. Oz and some of those appointments, and we hope that improves nationally. We're very interested in that on the front end, and that includes everything from mental health to safe UT to making sure kids have the resources that they need well ahead of any kind of a disaster like that. And then when there are the adults, like the real bad ones that show up that just are evil, and we've had some of those arrests this year, those ones we're going to go after way harder than we have in the past.
So on this subject, what I'm always looking for is just what Ryan said, and it is the preventative stuff with mostly awareness and mental health and just communities. And the sad truth is that we're living in an era where our kids will be aware of their safety when they go to school, and that'll include when they go to college, and that's not going to go away. So avoiding the topic, not very helpful. Even though it's stressful to try and find imperfect solutions for something that you're so averse to having happen, and that stops some of the dialogue. The one area that I sort of am profoundly against where Utah is going is that I don't think putting weapons in schools has really
so
good
through the
research.
Guardian program?
Yeah, there's not very good research that shows it's a preventative measure. It tends to be a catalytic when they're not particularly law enforcement. And the Guardian allows for non-trained officers. I have a slightly different point of view for officers, but there's some money. I mean, there's a lot of money, and it's not insignificant. The Guardian program makes me really nervous. I think it's put an undue, almost unwrap-aroundable burden on the sheriff's departments that we need to figure out how to not have them be in a position of not choosing, not training, and yet being responsible for a non-officer, sworn officer. But I do think the legislature is aware and working on these things, but I am not persuaded that the introduction into non-officers carrying weapons has any efficacy in terms of a preventative measure. I think the other...
It's not intended to be.
Yeah, and the other measures I do think are preventative, but I think I hear people saying, yeah, we just need a couple guys with guns. There's no research that doesn't show that that's not an escalation activity.
Yeah, we were talking even before the podcast began too, that Utah somehow has escaped some of the tragedies we've seen in other states, but we have seen problems here that you guys are able to look at, that you're able to deep dive into. We've seen threats coming into our schools, and you're able to take those and study them and try to figure out how to be better. So
this is one of those things that's it's hard to talk about because we don't want to imagine it. But as we've gone through this, the conversation that we're having right now is a good example. Like some of that stuff isn't accurate. It isn't what's happening. The sheriff has to qualify them, just like the school itself has to nominate. That training is being developed right now and rolled out. So we're afraid of a lot of these solutions too, but there haven't been, not only there have been some studies, but there's also we're not the first state to go down this road, right?
Yeah.
And we have watched that in Florida. We have watched that in Texas. We have watched that now in Tennessee, unfortunately, because they've already been to these places. I'm in Georgia here in a few weeks to walk through Appalachian High School, and I'll get to learn from them, as I have in each of these other states, where things went sideways. What worked, what didn't, what training did you have, didn't wasn't followed, what physical measures did you have, what surveillance did you have, did we get ahead of this one? Now there are already so many things we know about that case where both law enforcement screwed up with that particular investigation ahead of time. The parents were unconscionable. The dad has been charged appropriately, right? The mom probably should have been too, frankly, with how that was handled. But we're learning, unfortunately, from each of these terrible scenarios, what to do and what not to do. And that's the benefit that we talked about a little bit earlier with the process in Utah, is that we go through this, we study this stuff, we bring in the experts that we can find. There is one thing I mentioned on Monday in the School Security Task Force is, look, this is not scripture. We can change it. We will change it. It's going to change every year as we learn more. So if there's something we learn that improves that, one of the hardest things with the firearm in school argument is that they are already there. They're just not trained. And we don't have them qualified. There has been no mental health background check. There has been no training by anybody that's qualified.
Right, but that's a direct permissive result of our laws, right? And so if we don't like that fact, then we should not have as permissive laws. Like, that's like saying, gosh, what could we do about the proliferation of guns in schools? Well, I don't know. We've decided to conceal carry, reciprocity. You don't have to have training to hold a concealed weapon in the state of Utah, which is unconscionable, that you don't have to show proficiency at a weapon that you get to walk around my family with. I mean, the permissiveness of our gun laws are part of the problem, but we're not allowed to talk about it. I mean, I disagree with this, we really look at data and we really research the topic. We do if it falls in our ideological spectrum here. It can't touch anything about time, place, and manner on guns. That's not allowed in our political dialogue here, so we can't actually say we're dealing with violence in a non-biased way, because we're not.
I think we can talk about it. We already know. Also, there's the reality of political liability. I don't think that's happening here.
Right. I don't think Republicans are choosing to have a serious conversation about this because of their ideological position.
Well, they disagree with you on the
guns.
premise, let alone ideology. It's not because they're going down a list.
That's fine. I just disagree with the assertion of objectivity on it. Right. I'm fine that you have 61 and I have 14. Like, I live with that. That is not a dilemma for me. What's a dilemma is to pretend that there's a 360 review when there's a 180 review, and that is the prerogative of the majority.
All right, well, we'll be watching what happens there. Before we go, we're about out of time. I wanted to address this because it's something that's like...
I wasn't actually that way. As you know, guns worked me up.
I know. You talk guns with Maura, you're going to get her fired. So that was actually very calm for her. One thing that is aggravating me right now, because I work in a newsroom, and I should actually like this, because if you walk into a newsroom, you can hear the scanners humming. And since I started in the news business, I've lived with scanners. When I started out in Missoula, Montana, a small market, if you're the weekend anchor, you take the scanner home with you. You breastfeed your baby with the scanner in the background because you might have to run out to do whatever. So you just live with the scanner. You get used to hearing it. I'm so used to scanner noise that when I go home, I can't handle silence. I have to have
a scanner on to go to sleep.
No, not a scanner, but I do have to have noise on music or something. I feel anxious. So it's become a part of who I am, which I hate that it is. But to cover news and to be there quickly and to respond, and in the role of holding policing agencies accountable, safety. There's a lot of good reasons for us to be able to hear what's going on in the scanner. Changes are happening since 9/11. We've had the same radio system across the country. They're starting to switch over. As they're upgrading and switching, a lot of our Utah agencies, as those across the country, are choosing to encrypt, so we won't be able to hear that anymore. Many Utah agencies have already done this. There's a few that are still on the scanner. My concern might be different than someone else because of what they're trying to protect. 'Cause they're saying, privacy, there's phone numbers and people's personal information that goes across the scanner. Where do you see this from a safety standpoint? Do you have any concerns about encrypting where we won't be able to know always what's happening or where police are or if there's an officer involved shooting? Or do you have different concerns when you hear about this? Or you're like, high five, encrypt away?
Yeah, I've been more on the latter, on the high five, encrypt away. I mean, to tell you the truth, I haven't been worried about the newsroom in that conversation. That is strictly public safety, integrity of investigations, getting after people. Talk about the organized crime subcommittee, some of the stuff we get briefed in there. It's those things, not communicating to people that are intentionally here to take advantage and harm Utahns. Not communicating where we're coming and when to them. That stuff's pretty important to me. So I haven't, to be totally fair with you, I haven't even had the conversation with anybody in the news that has told me that they were worried about that until today.
I think this is a really stressful issue, and I think it's a bad decision for encryption. Law enforcement has always had encrypted channels. There's always been levels of communication. And when you're called on a domestic, the call doesn't go out and say, Heidi Hatch 6127 seems to be, they say there's a domestic.
Yeah.
And they often even use coded language that I know reporters know.
Yes.
But, and it's not hard, it's look it up, right? But there's always been protocol levels. And when you see an officer involved shooting, they will move to an encrypted channel to have a conversation. If names or vulnerable people are being talked about, which is, by the way, not what gets talked about on an original 911 call.
No.
But if they do, we've had encrypted services for 150 years, since we've had radios. So I think this is just an excuse, this technological upgrade is an excuse to take away the bread and butter. Because the only thing that the scanners are picking up are bread and butter. And I think some of it is worthy of a fire, a car crash. Some of it's worthy of the public and the news being real time on what's going on in their communities. If it is sensitive, it is already encrypted. And it's a bunch of malarkey for them to pretend like this is a life and safety and domestic and an issue of individual. There's nobody at risk listening to the scanner.
Yeah, and oftentimes if there's an officer involved incident, or let's say there was a shooting and a suspect on a run, maybe 6 or 8 hours later, the next day or something, they'll send out a press release and let us know.
Yeah.
But then we've got, people eventually calling and worried about, a gunman on the run in the neighborhood or whatever. And there are extreme circumstances where they'll put a reverse 911 call out and give people information. But I feel like oftentimes, as a news organization, we want to be the voice for people in communities, let them know what's going on, if there's a risk, and we won't be able to hear that. And honestly, we all understand the codes when we hear them, because if you work in the news business, you know what they mean. But more often than the codes, if you were to ask the people who run our assignment desk or us working at our desk, it's white noise to me. I work by the scanners. It's just like, it's a lullaby while I work. When my ears perk up, it's sad to say because it's what we're used to hearing. You can hear the emotion or the stress in people's voices when something is happening that you need to listen into. Mm-hmm. And you can hear when something's like, oh my gosh, okay, everybody, we should listen. And so, I guess selfishly, because this is what I do, I'd like to hear it. I do understand there's reasons why they may want to encrypt, but I am going to be frustrated possibly as we move forward with public accountability for police officers, what they're doing, what they're reacting to, all that stuff, if we can't hear any of that.
And the arguments they're making super lame-o. SLCPD's statement about, no, this actually helps transparency. Argue law enforcement if you want, but don't argue, it doesn't help transparency.
Yeah.
And that's the trade-off for that is safety. That's always been the trade-off for that. But SLCPD won't do press conferences, always sends a press person, won't send his chief, so there's no credibility in them asserting that this is a public safety issue.
Yeah. So I'm frustrated by it. It'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm assuming that at some point, if we blow up their phones, they're going to get annoyed and give us the scanners
They're
back.
just not going to answer.
Yeah, they won't, but there are some police agencies where you'll call. Shout out to Utah County and their public information officer, Spencer Cannon, best in the business, will answer any call any time of day. He'll meet you there, answer questions, super open. Some cities, though, you can call them and
You'll never get an answer.
you'll never get an answer. You'll never know what happened. And so it's frustrating for that public accountability and making sure that they're answering questions about what they're doing for the people and for the taxpayers. So I'm not super thrilled about that, but by
was
January.
that a policy decision, or was that this happens to be the tech that we're using?
Department by department, they're making the decision. And Davis County, I
So they're
think,
doing
is
one-on-one.
is one who said they're not going to do it. They could always change their mind, but most of them have gone dark at this point or have plans in the next couple of months to go dark.
So I mean, I'll just use the example that you talked about. We talked about it a little bit off the air, but the Middle East terrorists that threatened Utah schools last year.
Yeah.
March, one of the things that that stood out about that case is that he went through the state. He called 11 schools. He ended up at a high school in St. George, and then he left for an hour and called schools in Pennsylvania, right? And
He showed up at a school?
hang on. So
Okay,
he
I'm
left,
listening.
meaning he stopped calling Utah. He
Okay.
stopped calling Utah schools. So he went down the list, whatever list, however he decided.
Google.
And then he hit the high school in St. George, and then didn't call any Utah schools for an hour because he was calling another state. He actually hit 2 other states that day. But then came back an hour later and called the St. George school again because he didn't see enough action. He was listening, we think. At the very least, he was listening. Probably on the scanner app. You can get there's all sorts of apps that feed the.
Interesting.
But either that, or he had somebody with eyes on the school that could see that. By that point, we figured out that it was a hoax. We didn't have the same response we had at the schools in the north,
There weren't pictures of police online
which
or.
is part of the conversation about how it, was. We knew it was a test run. Like we had to anticipate that there was a reason why they were watching.
Do you believe that there were intentions beyond that, just causing a scare or a ruckus, that there was going to be something further down the road, or do you think it was just flipping the bird at
there's
America?
things I can't talk about on the podcast, but that investigation was turned over pretty quickly to the FBI, and then when I tell you Middle East terrorists, that's not a yes.
You're not making up the label.
Yeah. Yes,
Not
there
a
were
characterization
others
you
involved.
just
Yeah,
used.
and so I
Well
guess,
beyond
I mean,
GPS and
and that's
yeah.
important to hear about, because, you always look at your side of the story of, what's frustrating to you. Same thing that happened with mugshots when they went away. I know there's reasons, because you don't want to have a mugshot out there if somebody's innocent and they're not
Yeah.
guilty of that crime. But at the
Yeah,
same
I had
time,
that
too,
ability.
when we were talking about the recent Southern Utah University case, Utah Tech. I was like,
Yeah.
what is their name? Utah Tech in St. George, and they had an accused rapist that within 45 minutes went into 3 different dorms and attacked 3 different women. People were like, I want to see him, like, have I seen him around my schools? Do my kids interact with him?
Yeah.
And we couldn't give him anything. He had been convicted of 2 other DUIs, and after grandma requests, which are the requests we can put in, after several weeks, they eventually sent us the picture, and we have that now because he's been convicted in other cases. But that was the overwhelming question we were getting from everyone online, is like, we need to
Show
see
us.
him, we're frustrated, we're scared. Have we seen him around our kids? Do we need to talk to them about if something could have happened? But we couldn't show them their face because the law
Okay,
said
so
no.
this is going to be funny, and it might be a good example for whoever watches our podcast. But this is how it works in real life. Like when you happen to be working with a legislator that works in a given area. I'm happy to look into this whole thing with the radio thing. I haven't. It hasn't been an area of
Ooh, I've
expertise
got
of mine.
friends in the right place.
Well, no, but in all seriousness, right? That's how it happens.
Yeah.
Like I'm talking to Maura about some,
Yeah.
it's like water
Yeah.
law once, and I ended up changing the thing because of the conversation I had with Maura.
Ooh,
right,
she's
that-
good about water.
She is good at water law. That's legit. But in this example, I literally haven't had this conversation
Yeah.
with anybody in the news, and haven't really thought about that. But I do have the perspective that I've shared a little piece of with you, where I don't know that I want that out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, is why it's important to sit down and have these conversations, because there's different perspectives and things to be gained from them, and understanding someone else's side of the story. So I think that's why it's great that you both
We'll
agreed to
figure it
come and sit in a room, small room, caged
Small
in, with
room
the
with no
door
air.
locked, no air, no windows.
Absolutely no air.
Yes, I know. If we look sweaty, it's because we are. So yeah, thanks for having these conversations. And honestly, I always leave from these podcasts with 5 more stories that I'm like, hey, we got a call about, because you guys picked my brain into something else that we need to look into, because sometimes you only see what's on the surface or what's in your little realm or world that you're talking about. So yeah.
Happy Thanksgiving.
I know. Do you have
Yeah.
big plans, Maura? Are you
No,
cooking at your house?
We are. We're having, I think
she just invited us over.
Ooh,
I'm having
the
all
mama-in-law
of you,
has invited us
all of
over.
you, yeah. Yeah, we're having a grundle. I think we have 26 coming.
Ooh.
Oh my goodness.
No, that's
Get out the
that's
card
how I
tables.
feel.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. We hope it's good weather because I'm sitting outside.
All right. I know. I think it's going to actually
How
be
about-
cold.
are
Drive
you
it
at
cold.
your house?
We are at my house, which is not normal. My mom usually does, because
Right.
she has one of like the longest tables you've ever seen, that you can see, everyone that you know from every realm of your life. But my mom is currently directing a play right now and a little stressed out. She's got a lot going
That's
on.
cool.
So I have taken on the responsibility of doing it at my house. And
Wow.
luckily, a lot of people are out of town, so I'll only have 16 to be in charge of. But I'm feeling the pressure. At night, I'm laying awake thinking about what tablecloths will go for Thanksgiving, because I'm also putting up Christmas, because my daughter's flying in for Thanksgiving, but not Christmas, so I'm double dutying it. So I'm trying to be the perfect mom, so I hope it all works out.
good
Oof.
luck.
How about at your house?
This is our off year, kind of.
Yeah.
So we do the every other with the
Yeah.
different sides, and and then there's divorces and remarriages,
Yeah,
and
exactly.
Makes it all complicated.
Yes, we'll be driving a lot.
Woo, you're
This
going to be
next
so
week.
full, dropping into everyone's home.
2 days of driving each way. I'll just
Oh,
say
wow,
that.
really?
And and then people are flying in from
Yeah.
around the country. Yeah, so it'll be fun, and
And slightly stressful.
I'm a little scared of Wyoming.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
See, I've done that. I've been on this trip. And
Weather-wise?
come back. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
You ever done cross that southern part of Wyoming on that freeway in the middle of a snowstorm?
I've
blizzard?
driven that
drive
before.
to
It's
and
terrible.
From Denver, probably. So I grew up in Denver.
Okay.
And I've been commuting for most holidays. It's very unusual that
Oh.
we're not in Denver for the holidays.
Okay.
And my dad actually just drove to Utah for a couple of days earlier through the great state of Wyoming, in which they had 60-mile-an-hour gusts
Yeah.
on a perfectly lovely day.
Yeah.
I got nothing but bad stories. 2 years ago, coming home from Christmas. Here's the important part: coming home. So you're not
Yeah.
even happy anymore.
Right.
Yes.
It's all over
That
with.
was the one from 8 years
There
ago
is
that I'm
one
scared to
boom
death of right now.
gate that
Yeah.
stands between you and Evanston.
Yeah.
Little America's right there, which,
Yeah.
oh, by the way, for all of our listeners, according to my daughter who drove home yesterday from college, Little America's gift shop restrooms are closed. You have to go under remodel. I was
There's
like,
not a
what's
lot of
going
places
on?
to go.
But you cannot get your 75-cent ice cream.
Oh,
from
that was my
Little
next
America.
question.
No,
Okay.
they're closed right now, so that's important. The boom gates come down. We are on the freeway for 7.5 hours.
Oh my gosh.
Less than a mile away from freedom, because Utah doesn't close the roads like
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
we had stocking candy
Yeah.
To live on.
and we all had half a water bottle. It was
Okay, well, yeah.
good
that's what I
times.
have.
There's
I'm
my
just gonna be
sorry
watching
to
the-
you and
I know. I'm just hoping that the atmospheric river of doom that's coming
Oh,
from the
that's
West
right.
Coast doesn't cause problems here, because my daughter, I don't know what I was thinking when I booked her flight, isn't getting until midnight on Wednesday night before Thanksgiving. So I'll be hanging out at the airport with all the other stressed out families,
No
hoping their
kidding.
family makes it. So,
All right.
yeah. It's weird having adult children and having them come. I'm like, how did
Yeah.
I get to this stage of life? It's just
so
weird.
true.
Yeah, so happy Thanksgiving to everyone who is listening, and hope we're all recovering from the election. Onward and upward. So many things to talk about as we
Well,
head towards the
if
new
it
year.
doesn't work out, we're coming to your guys' house.
Okay,
Great, sounds good.
party,
Sounds
gluten-free,
good.
dairy-free from my house. I'll see you
You'll
then.
wanna come to
Oh, when I come to
Yeah.
this one.
I would go to
for
Maura's
sure.
house for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay.
Well, thanks for listening, everyone. I'm
Gluten-free,
out.
I was
dairy-free.
going to ask you if you cook. Do you cook meat or